the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. And those two major river basins produce fertility. So these are very fertile valleys, the Nile Delta and the Nile Valley, and then the Tigris and the Euphrates, what used to be called Mesopotamia, which means the middle of the rivers, Meso, middle, and Potamia rivers. So between the two rivers, a very fertile plain, very flat. Now then, these two fertile areas were the centers of power in the ancient world. These were the East and West world powers. So the whole Old Testament is a struggle between these two world powers, between Egypt and the different empires that arose here, notably Assyria and Babylon. That's where Saddam Hussein is now. That's where Iraq and Iran are now. Iran is here. Iraq is over here. But they are divided by this river. So we have two world powers in the ancient Middle East, and in between the Promised Land. Now you notice that the Arabian Desert covers all of this, and the Sahara there. So when these two big powers attacked each other or tried to overcome each other, they had to travel through this narrow bit of land here. Don't know if you can see a rather purpley patch here. That is actually black basalt rock, which is very sharp and very hard. Even camels can't cross it, which means that all the traffic was directed down this narrow coastal strip. If you didn't want to cross the desert, which most didn't, but if you wanted to keep feeding your troops, you had to go through the Fertile Crescent. You had to go round that crescent to the other end to attack your enemy, which means that this was the crossroads of the world, actually. And somebody has said about Israel, if you will live in the middle of a crossroads, you're bound to get run over, which is exactly what happened. They were constantly being run over. In Jesus' day, they were run over by the Romans. But before that, they'd been run over by the Greeks and the Syrians and the Egyptians, and so it goes on. And so here we have two world powers at either end of this crescent, with a narrow corridor down the coast in between. And that is the narrow corridor. And God gave them a land at the crossroads of the world. Actually, the road from Europe comes to Arabia, comes down through that corridor, and the road from Africa to Asia goes through that corridor. On this map, the road from Europe comes down the coast, it crosses the plain of Esdraelon, goes down into the Jordan Valley, and up onto the other side and down to Arabia. The road from Africa comes up the coastal plain, and it crosses over the same Vale of Esdraelon, or the Valley of Jezreel, and goes up through Capernaum and up through Damascus and on to India and China. So that the actual crossroads of the world is precisely there, at a little hill called Megiddo. And the hill of Megiddo in Hebrew is Harmageddon. And that's why most of the big battles in history took place there, at the crossroads of the world. Overlooking that crossroads is a little village called Nazareth. And a boy of Nazareth could watch the world go by. Literally, he could lie on the hill as a boy could Jesus, and it would like being in an airport lounge where you see all the nationalities coming and going. That's why they call this northern part Galilee of the nations, because it was an international crossroads. Whereas further south up in the hills, it was very isolated and very Jewish. And Jerusalem is right up in them there hills, just about here. So you had two parts of the Promised Land, the international part, where all the nations came and went, and this very Jewish, isolated part up in the hills with Jerusalem. So you can see the importance of this land. God was going to plant his people at the crossroads of the world, where everybody could see them, where they could be a model of the kingdom of heaven on earth. So the whole world could see what blessing comes to people living under God's rule. But they would also see what curse comes of disobeying God's rule. So you can see why God chose this land. Now, it's a very fertile strip. Here's that black basalt. If you've ever been to Capernaum, you've seen the black basalt rock. They used it to build the houses of Capernaum. Terribly hard, sharp stuff. And so it was impassable. So there was this barrier of sand and basalt rock on the east and the barrier of the sea on the west, all the traffic went down the coast here and through this little break in the hills, which we call the Vale of Israel on Armageddon. Then we have this huge crack right down the Earth's surface, right through to Africa, and here is its deepest point. The white bit is below sea level, and the Dead Sea is way below. You have the Jordan coming into this valley and going nowhere, just evaporating from the intense heat. So in this little area, the size of Wales, you have the entire world in miniature. You've got every kind of climate and every kind of scenery. You will find somewhere in Israel a place like home. In fact, the place most like it, England, is just south of Tel Aviv, down here. It's just like England. But they call Carmel little Switzerland. And you can always go skiing at any time of year on the snow-capped Mount Helena here. And yet 10 minutes later, you can be down among palm trees here. All the fauna and flora of Europe is to be found here. All the fauna and flora of Africa is to be found here. All the fauna and flora of Asia is to be found here. So you can have Scottish pine trees growing next to palm trees from the Sahara. And in the Bible days, all the wild animals were here. Lions, bears, crocodiles, camels. You've got the whole world squeezed into this little point where they all join. Fascinating. Well, I could go on for hours, but I must stop. But once you've got a feel of the geography, and especially a feel for the shape of the land. Now, this is a relief map of the Promised Land. Can you see that deep valley running north-south? A little bit of green on that side, and a little bit of green on that side, and then the desert. If you master that map and hold it in your mind, you will be able to read every Bible story that takes place in the Promised Land very easily. And you'll know why things happen as they do. And why Samaria was in the middle. Why Jesus' main ministry was up in Galilee. Why he was put to death by the Jews. That doesn't mean by all his ways. It means the people of Judah. And when you read in the Gospel of John that the Jews killed Jesus, that doesn't mean all Israel. It means the southerners up in the hills. The Galileans were all for Jesus. It was the Jews, the Judeans, who were against him in the south. So, that's the geographical background of the Bible. In the Old Testament, you're moving around that fertile crescent from one end to the other. Sometimes the people of God are slaves in Egypt. Other times they're taken away into Syria or Babylon at this end. There they were right in the middle of it all, at the crossroads of it all. Now the other dimension that we need to master is the dimension of time. And I've tried to reduce this dimension of time to a very simple pattern that's easily held in your mind. And at first sight that chart must look horrific to you. But as we go through it, I think you'll find it's actually very simple. Basically, the Old Testament covers 2,000 years of history, BC, before Christ. But there is in Genesis 1 to 11 what we might call the prehistoric part. That means prehistoric to Israel. And so in Genesis 1 to 11 we have the creation of the universe, the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, the flood, and the Tower of David. It's all about man generally. It's not about God's chosen people. It's about man, the human race. And that's the prehistoric history of Israel, before their history really began. But their history begins around the year 2000 BC. So just as far as we are after Christ, the history of Israel starts before Christ, 2,000 years either side. All right? That's our opening date for the history of Israel. And I divide it into 4 equal parts of 500 years each. And we take those 4 quarters as distinct periods. We mark each of the 4 dates, 2000, 1500, 1500 BC, with events and people. And I like to give names of people and events to these days, so I fix them in my mind. And so the first four words I've written down are events: election, Exodus, empire, exile. And you've got the four events that mark the four quarters of their history. That's when God chose Abraham and elected Abraham and his descendants to be his people. That's when Moses led them out of Egypt. That's when they had all the land God promised to them and had a time of unparalleled prosperity and peace. And called it the empire because they not only had their own land, but many other nations were now under their control. And then the lowest point of their history, exile. And roughly speaking, those four events fit those 4 days. Then I attach a prominent person to each of those dates. Abraham is the man to attach to 2000, Moses to 1500 or thereabouts, David to 1000, he was reigning in the year 1000 BC, and Isaiah is the most prominent man associated with the exile. So you've got 4 events and 4 people. But also, the leadership of Israel changed. And the leadership in each of these 4 periods was different. In the first period, they were led by patriarchs. That's a word for forefathers, patriarchs. From Abraham to Joseph. In the second period, they were led by prophets. From Moses to Samuel. In the third 500 years, they were led by princes. From Saul to Zedekiah. And in the fourth period, they were led by priests. From Joshua, came as Zerubbabel back from the exile, right through to Caiaphas in our Lord's day. So you can see that the leadership changed from patriarchs to prophets, to princes, and then to priests. Now, it doesn't mean there weren't prophets at other times, or priests at other times, but the leadership of the nation passed from one group to the other, until Jesus came, who was prophet, priest, and king, all rolled into one. So they tried 3 different kinds of leadership in their history, but they were really looking for someone who could combine all these things in one. And all the leadership failed in the Old Testament. So have you got those 4 basic periods in your mind? Now once you've got that, the next thing is to put in 2 gaps, each of them 400 years. The first gap is here, the second gap is here. And during those 400 years, on both occasions, God said nothing and he did nothing. So there is nothing in the Bible from those 2 periods. Now, of course, there are books written in those 2 periods, but they're not in our Bible, because they do not cover the time when God was saying and doing things. You see, when we read this phrase in the Bible, the living God, do you realize what that means? Well, did you realize a few years ago what it meant when some theologians started saying God is dead? You heard that phrase. Well, do you realize what they meant? They did not mean that God has ceased to exist. That was a popular misunderstanding. What they meant was God is no longer active in this world. He still exists, but he's somewhere else now. As you know, my wife and I lost our daughter last July. She was 36. She's dead. That doesn't mean she's ceased to exist. She's alive, she's conscious, she's communicating. But she can't communicate with us now. But she's not living now. Now that really means she's not speaking and acting in this world as she was. But she's full of consciousness and communicating with us today. And she's with the Lord. So she's alive, but she's not living in this world. As far as this world goes, she's dead. Now that's what the living God means. And during these 2 periods, God was dead for them. See, he was not acting in this world. He was out of touch. And so the books written in these periods, the books written in this gap were the Apocrypha. And you won't find them in our Bibles. The Catholics put them in their Bibles, because they find prayers to the saints and purgatory in the Apocrypha. That's why they put it in. But in fact, it doesn't belong to the Bible, because those books were written in the day when God was not living. But in these periods, he was the living God who was speaking and acting in our world. Now, once you've got those two gaps, that gap occurred in the first quarter, and this gap occurred in the last quarter. And that's why Malachi is the last book in your Bible, though there's a 400-year gap before Matthew comes in. Because God wasn't saying anything, he wasn't doing anything. So we're not interested in the history. It's just like any other history. And similarly here, we've got nothing between Genesis and Exodus, though there's a 400-year gap there. And we often miss that when we read straight on. But Exodus makes it clear there's a 400-year gap. It's interesting what happened during the gap. In the gaps when God was silent and inactive, the Egyptian, the Indian, and the Chinese culture developed in that gap. And in this gap, you had people like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and the Greek philosophers influenced the Western world so much. You had Buddha, Confucius, and then you had people like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. See, when God isn't busy, man is. And that's when so much has happened in man's history. It's really not of relevance to God, because it's what God's history contains that is of importance to us. Now then, let's look at some details. Genesis 12 to 50 picks up the first period of Israel's history when they were led by patriarchs. And it's possible that the book of Job comes in there as well. Everything in Job is very much the sort of life that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived, of the traveling people of those days. Then we come to the next quarter, and again we only have a few books from that quarter: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all from Moses' lifetime, and then Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, continuing the history of that period. Then we have the Empire days, and we have more books. We have the history of the third quarter of their history in Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, but we also have some poetic books. David and the book of Psalms, Solomon, the Song of Solomon, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. But after Solomon, there was civil war, and the 12 tribes divided into two. 10 in the north called themselves Israel, 2 in the south called themselves Judah. And from then on, they didn't have a united nation. There were prophets during that time, Elijah and Elisha, but they didn't write down for subsequent generations what they prophesied, so we don't have books called by them. Then suddenly, we have a flood of books, all prophets, and all associated with the exile. And that's when the main books of prophecy are written. And some of them prophesied before the exile, some of them during the exile, and some after the exile, which tells us how important this event was in their history, the loss of the land God had promised them. These prophets warned them they were going to lose the land. These prophets comforted them when they did lose the land. And these prophets were concerned with rebuilding the land when they came back after 70 years ago. We have one or two history books from this period. Daniel and Esther were both about the Jews away from the land when they were in Babylon. Ezra and Nehemiah, which we're going to discuss later, they were the two men who helped to rebuild Jerusalem and get the people established back in their own land. Well, now, does that give you a feel of the Old Testament? Unfortunately, you see, the books of the Old Testament are not always in chronological order, especially the prophets. The history books seem to be, but when you get to the prophets, they simply put the big ones first and the little ones second, which is terribly confusing. And what I'm saying is that of each of the prophet books, you need to ask, was this written before the exile, during the exile, or after the exile? And that will give you a clue to the understanding. Now, I hope all is crystal clear. But if you can memorize the basic features of that with its 2,000 years of history divided into 500 years each, then you'll get a really good grasp, and then you fit the books in. And of course, there are different types of books.